That's mine. I control that. As if the other person is chattel, or as if they own or can command the actions of another person. I believe it becomes very worrisome at times when we have to see how that perception of ownership leads to situations that you, Mr. Speaker, may have to treat to in the law courts when a person then takes matters into their own hand because they believe that that person that they own acting in a manner in which they believe they should not have acted, they decide to maim or hurt or even kill, in some cases, that individual. So I strongly welcome the section that relates to a spouse, and I'm clear on the no disillusionment as to what spouse means for the purpose of the discussions we are having under the amendments before us. I would wish to comment, though, specifically, and I would wish the public at large to zero in on the latter part of a clause, I believe it is at clause 8, which specifies what a sexual offense is, in my mind, where it recognizes, and I know that the Honourable Minister with responsibility for Home Affairs, when he spoke earlier, he was very expansive in his definition. But where he pointed to the fact that it is not simply about a penis penetrating the anus or vagina of another person, but it also refers to body parts or using other things. And I believe that repetition is worthy only because some people, or many people, will not take the time to read through these pieces of legislation. But part of the education or the sensitization when we debate these bills and when they become passed into law has to be to ensure that individuals understand the protections that are before them. So I would really wish that as part of our sensitization, whether it's in schools or in different groups and so on, that we zero the public in to the specific adjustments that were made, positive adjustments that demonstrate that rape can occur not only through the penetration of a penis, but through objects and so on, and other body parts, whether a hand, a finger, or whatever. Mr. Speaker, the principle of consent and the process of consent therefore come into play, and I want to spend some time examining what I believe are some of the prerequisites, and these are the things that we get coming through from the bill, or from the amendments to the bill, even if not spelled out. Information is an important prerequisite. People must know what the dangers are. People must know what they are exposing themselves to when they get involved in sexual activity. Then, using this information, they must be able to understand it and break it down. They must also have the competence before the process of consent can be perceived as being achieved. It's not only important that people have information, it is more important that they have the understanding and the competence, therefore, to make a decision. They must be willing, because consent is not going to come unless you're willing. They must volunteer, even, and there must be the lack of coercion, and that's also very important, because some people may appear willing to some, but then when you look at the context and you realize why they are reluctantly giving consent, is because they feel pressured or because they feel fear. And there must be the absence of these if we are to be satisfied that the prerequisites for consent exist. So as long as a person understands information and can break it down in a way that they can compare or analyze it to the extent that they can then make an informed decision on who or how or where they will engage in sexual activity, there's every likelihood then that they should be able to consent or reject. So they then have control over how they use their yes or their no. In other words, Mr. Speaker, I'm satisfied that the amendments underpinned by the process of consent as reflected in the amendments has also led in a very important way to the decriminalization of some sexual activity. And I'm satisfied that the Honourable Speaker that went before me has gone into this quite expansively enough for all to understand. Sexual acts only become a criminal offense where there is no consent. The amendments reinforce that consent is needed for sexual activity of any kind. It does not specify what kinds of sexual activity, but by expanding the definition of rape, we are saying that the amendments require consent before sexual activity of any kind. Even where you are married or in an intimate relationship, consent is required. So the principle and the process of consent with the prerequisites I outlined, these are important. Sexual interaction is not valid where there is threat, real or perceived, whether there is force, whether there is fear. And these are the important things that we need the public at large to understand. And naturally, Mr. Speaker, there will be some categories that we sideline or examine or look to for special consideration as we look at the need for providing further protection to them. As we heard earlier, there is protection for individuals who suffer with mental and physical disorders, and I believe that subsequent speakers may get into this as well. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to spend some time where I'm still having a little difficulty reconciling how we offer protection to minors and the extent to which the coverage for minors is as expansive as perhaps it could be. I support in the main the amendments proposed for sections 5A, 5B, and 5C. As we've heard, those sections relate to offenses that relate to touching indirectly or directly any part of a body of a minor with any part of another person's body for sexual purposes, with an object for sexual purpose, and I'll add that on for the avoidance of any doubt. It refers to inviting or counseling or inciting minors to touch another person with any part of their body or with any object with an object for sexual purpose as well. It also refers to intentionally meeting a minor, and I thought this one was so interesting. Whether inside Barbados or not, whether at home in Barbados, so you talk to that minor, you lure them, you try to excite them, and whether in Barbados or outside of Barbados, and you are found to be engaged in what is being called sexual grooming, that is an offense. I agree with all these things, Mr. Speaker, but where I'm still at odds, and this is notwithstanding hearing the Honourable Attorney General go down very eloquently through the rationale behind how you try to standardize the ages between 14 and 16 and so on, and what the age of consent with is being 16 in Barbados, and notwithstanding the fact that in many jurisdictions as well, the age of consent is 16. There are also some jurisdictions where the age of consent is as much as 21 and as low as 14. So, Mr. Speaker, where I am having a little difficulty, and perhaps this is the absence of legal training and so on, I recall very well that this government has committed at every step of the way where there's relevant legislation that was up for amendment to ensuring the protection of this nation's children to the greatest extent that we can. I recall, I believe it was in 2020, 2021, I believe it was 2021, agreeing with the age for individuals being able to purchase liquor and so on. I agreed to the reset from the age of 16 to the age of 18 so that a person who sells or supplies liquor to a minor now under 18, or a person who aids a minor in consuming liquor, or who employs a minor in connection with the sale or supply of liquor, that age was moved from 16 to 18. I was one in strong support of that. I remember earlier this year, and I heard the Honourable Member for St. Joseph outlining the fact that different things can apply for different pieces of legislation. But when we met in the committee that has responsibility, the standing committee that has responsibility for examining social and environmental issues, in the exchanges, one of the overarching concerns was this very fact that we had definitions that meant different things in different places. And we approved, and it's passed in those bills, no acts, that a child is a person that is less than 18 years old. And the concern as we examine the two bills at the time, which are no acts of this Parliament, was that as we try to standardize the pieces of legislation, we should not standardize them at the lowest level possible, but we should standardize them in a way that offers maximum protection to people, in this case, children. And where I'm at odds with the amendments before us is that, in my view, as we have sought to standardize between 14 and 16 and so on, I believe that we could have gone further to make the definition of a minor reflect one that is consistent with the Child Justice Bill and the Child Protection Bill and the Liquor License Act, carrying that age to age 18. I think, too, where I have further concern is when I look further into the amendments proposed in this piece of legislation surrounding the whole issue of incest. Now, incest, let me pull it up, and I believe that's where perhaps for me it's hardest to fathom. Under the section relating to incest, it recognizes as an offense of incest where intercourse is with a child, stepchild, foster child, ward, or defendant that is under the age of 18. And this is why it troubled me and still troubles me. Because why is it a criminal offense when you are having sex with your child under 18, but not when you're having sex with my child under 18? The age as it relates to my child is the age of 16. So I think that in a response, I would like to have further clarification, elucidation around the thinking involved in specifying that the age of a minor for the purpose of this act should remain at 16, when within the same act, we set an age limit of 18 when that sex is with a person that you are related to, either through blood or legal adoption and so on. And if there is any merit in it, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that it would be able to have consideration to the extent that we can even amend it before it leaves this place without it having to come before the Committee with Responsibility for Social and Environmental Matters. Not that if it has to come, we will reject it, but I believe that if we consider that it is something that we may have missed, or if not, and there is a suitable clarification that can be offered to beyond the fact that the age of consent is now 16, because that age can be moved as well. And I believe that there's a section of the proposed amendments that says or intimate that nothing or no amendment that is now passed should have any influence over previous decisions and so on. So it would only influence going forward. So it shouldn't matter if last week a mother gave consent or a parent gave consent for their daughter or son to be married at 16. It shouldn't apply to that. But I think that we should reflect a little bit more on this for consistency's sake. I think that in the same way a child who is under 18 is deemed to be vulnerable to alcohol, is deemed to be a child that is considered in need of protection, that we need to extend the provisions under the amendments that we have before this Honourable Chamber in giving further consideration to extending the age beyond 16 for minors, as it currently is, and amending it upward to the age of 18. With those, pardon? Not the age of consent, the age of a minor, and consequentially, it will imply adjusting the age of consent, I recognize. But minor for the purpose of this act is a child or a person under the age of 16, and my proposal is to adjust it to under the age of 18. So with that consideration and with that contribution, Mr. Speaker, I am obliged.
Honourable Member for St. Philip North.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Speaker, since you couldn't hear me. First of all, let me say that the legislation before us, I think it means well. There's good meaning to it. And so far today, there was good conversation on both sides of the aisle, in my opinion, despite what some may object. I think we had learned from both sides of the aisle. But I want to speak about things that we need to think about, first of all, when it comes to this legislation, things surrounding it, things that we need to address while it may be in tandem or right after this legislation is passed. But one of the things I want to speak about is education, first of all. Education of the public is important. The Honourable Member for St. George North alluded to it when she spoke about really what rape is. I think we need to start by educating the guardians and the teachers and the parents of these individuals, children to be specific, on the signs of rape, what to look for. Too often, Too often we see many minors presenting issues to parents and step-parents and girlfriends and boyfriends, and they never believed. The first thing they say is the child is lying. Children hardly lie about these things. These are things that we need to think about going forward with the legislation, to let parents and guardians and step-parents and teachers understand that children don't often lie when it comes to sexual offenses, and to take them seriously. At least they're worth investigating. I have had cases myself, and I think I spoke about it before, where the Child Care Board, I don't want to say ignored me, but failed to really investigate the circumstances of one of the cases I reported. To some extent, I think parents need to hold some sort of responsibility for their children. And before I forget, I want to divert here. We spoke about minors being 16 or below in terms of punishment from the law. But what do we do in a case, and this is a real case, if I have a 14-year-old well-thinking male, decent secondary school, if there's such a thing as decent secondary school or indecent, and raped a 5-year-old cousin, where does he stand in the law? Given this 16-year limit what did it say? Let me not mix up my words. That, right, a minor 16 years or under cannot be considered as committing a sexual offense. So these are the little gray areas we speak of. And while I'm remembering the Honourable Member for St. George North, I am not sure how I feel about the age of consent in terms of going up, because now we beg, and I brought it up before, we beg to consider when a child is allowed to seek medical attention, to get contraception. It goes on and on and on. And as doctors, we face this dilemma every day. Do we treat? Do we give a child contraception? Do we not? Risk pregnancy, unwanted pregnancies. So there's a whole lot of ramifications when we think about shifting the age of consent legally. And then what do parents do? Can parents try to prosecute somebody that is 24 years old, that basically, I say, slept, not raped, with their 18-year-old daughter, 16-year-old daughter, 17-year-old daughter? Where do we stand on that? So these are questions that I wonder. For now, I want to move on to the punishments meted out to these people. And I agree with the Honourable Member, Leader of the Opposition, when he said that why should children be taken, you have more or less a less of offense than an adult when it comes to sexual offenses. Sexual offenses, rape, it follows a person. I can't speak of, obviously, personal experience, but I have had people close to me in terms of patients and so on. And regardless of the age that this happened, the assault, the abuse, it goes with them almost, I want to say, for life. Some manage to put it behind them in terms of subconscious, but invariably it always comes up. And one of the things that I want to blame for this is the speed or lack thereof of the court system in Barbados. I'm happy to hear the Attorney General speak about that in terms of some improvement in terms of judges. But I'm hearing and confirmed really that, yes, we have the judges in place, but we need the supporting staff. I have seen people who have been raped at 10 years old, and 10 years later, 14 years later, they never came to a resolution. One in particular, she just decided to drop the case for fear that people might find out it's her, for fear that she has a good job now and she doesn't want that to be a part of it, because Barbados is small and things come out. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed post haste, really, the speed at which we handle these cases. I have had victims of incest basically ignored by the parents, ignored cases won't come up. And I had the misfortune of listening to a lady who was the victim of incest for several years, her father. And I had the displeasure of hearing her come to the conclusion that it was her fault because she liked it. Psychologically, these things affect people seriously. one of the things we need to get to as soon as cases are reported, and I stand corrected if it's already happening, but it's urgent counseling of these individuals who are, whether it be male, female, girl, boy, who are victims of these, of rape, sexual assault. This is something, sometimes you hear that the school, for instance, the government pays for X amount of sessions, 5 sessions, I can't remember how many sessions, and then what happens? You have a family that can't afford it, and psychological, psychiatric treatment is not inexpensive. I think we as a government need to support these people a little longer when it comes to psychological treatment, psychiatric treatment if it comes to that, because it's extremely important in cases like that. You have, psychology, but then back to the court system. I've met women who live in the same neighborhood as their attackers. Case is delayed, person out on bail, and every day they pass them at the bus stop. And sometimes the accusers are not necessarily kind. Society, to some extent, still thinks that it's the woman's fault. And they're subject to teasing, to jeers, to insults. The family gets to the point where some of them are ostracized. So we have to put things in place. One of the things I want to question, because I really didn't understand, forgive me, my non-legal mind, was the part with corroboration in the courts. Why I ask that? Because if you don't, corroboration can support both the victim or the alleged victim and the alleged accuser. And it was really unclear, forgive my ignorance, so I would like some clarification on that. Because oftentimes, every case of alleged rape is not always rape. I have had personal friends that picked up a lady on the way, and person asked for money. And if you don't give me money, I will report you to police for rape. Before you know it, the accuser is in court, name all over the newspaper, because there's no protection in my mind for the alleged accuser. Name all over the newspaper, all over the news, and if that person happens to be innocent or guilty, when the case is over, you're guilty by any means. Doesn't matter. You have that stand. So sometimes I think we need to start moving in the direction of protecting both the accused and the accuser. I'm not supporting rape by any measure, but every case is not a guilty case. And these are things we need to look at. And corroboration, what does it mean? For instance, something like a rape case. Rape is one of the hardest things to prove. We heard about the husband and wife. I have no idea how a lawyer approaches that in terms of if a husband rapes a wife. You will have to educate me. I have no idea. Rapes are hardly ever witnessed. Hardly ever witnessed. Who's to say who's right? I have no idea if the forensic lab is up and running, because obviously DNA evidence is, some jurisdictions, in my mind, crucial to things like that when there's a question. So I would love some clarity on the corroboration. Again, sorry for my slowness on that part of the corroboration. I am happy with the violation of mentally and physically abnormal, or subnormal, I should say. And I hope that includes cases of unconsciousness for illness, because it has happened around the world where people in institutions where they're unconscious have been raped. I haven't seen it there, but that will be something to put in there. And the mention of those in positions of power, the protection from the potential victims from those in positions of power. And this falls in line with the lower echelons of employment, as some people might say, and the higher. We all know of cases in the political arena too, where women have been subjected to submitting, for want of a better word, to her boss, employer, to get a promotion, to get food for the children. So I'm happy that that is there as well. So basically, these are some of the things I want to to bring up to the Parliament, but with all good intentions, we could bring as much of this legislation as we like. If some of the things aren't addressed, the speed of the court, as I said, counseling, education of teachers, let these more counselors in schools. I don't think we have enough, because there are several children in our schools that have been victims of abuse, whether it be relatives. I heard a phrase lately where it was said that the men, I never heard it myself, thank God, but the men used to say, 0 to 11 is breakfast, 12 is lunchtime for me. You can interpret that how you like, but I know what it means. So, well, so basically, as I said, all of these things mean well, but unless we put things on the ground to make this count, it won't happen. But all in all, I support the legislation. Thank you, Your Honor.
Honourable Member for St. James North.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this amendment to the Sexual Offences Act, which has been brought before this Parliament today by the Honourable Attorney General. I will speak mainly, Mr. Speaker, on issues of the provisions relating to mentally and physically challenged persons. But before that, sir, make some general comments on some of the other sections. One section, of course, I am happy to see the words imbecile and idiot removed. Those words continued from the 1992 Act, Section 8. And they're now replaced by mental disorder and physical disability. And as the Honourable Minister of Home Affairs said, this Parliament removed those words from the Immigration Act in December 2018, because the Immigration Act had said that no idiot or imbecile could enter Barbados, which is abject foolishness. And that was removed when I was Minister of Home Affairs. So that is consistent with that. And I would wish to urge the Office of the Attorney General to look to see if there is still remaining any other legislation on our statute books which speaks towards idiots and imbeciles. Because clearly, sir, that there are words that are offensive, they're outdated now. I know that some international bodies, and I know the Honourable Minister of Home Affairs is aware, have Barbados on lists that are not so kind because, well, they were still under the impression that Barbados had those words in our immigration law. And I had to point out to them that was not so. The issue of spousal rape, which the Honourable Member for St. Philip North has just raised. Yes, in a lot of cases that could be difficult to prove, but I know traditionally, and the law was reformed even before legislation came into place to speak towards this spousal rape being within the context where there's a separation order, as you would know, Mr. Speaker, between the parties. But as is in a lot of cases, the parties still live in the same house because neither of them, at least according to them, could afford to move, or matters relating to disposal of the matrimonial home have not been finalized, and therefore, it's possible for rape or alleged rape to take place, but in a situation where there's no consent on the alleged victim's part because there's separation agreement, they're no longer getting along well. The 1 year period in which you have to show under our family law that you're separated is in effect. And is that kind of circumstances in which spousal rape could allegedly take place. The issue of the act deeming no consent where a person uses their authority for sexual intercourse with someone is again very forward-thinking, visionary, and in reality, I believe that coincides too with our sexual harassment legislation. And again, that can go both sides, because it could also be that a female is in a senior position and uses her seniority in terms of the workplace or wherever for sexual advantage over a male. So again, that is gender neutral as well. The issue, Mr. Speaker, of reconciling different pieces of legislation, of course, the cybercrime bill, which is presently still before Parliament, with the report of the Policy and Governance Committee being before the Senate at the present time. There are similar sections in that bill, sections 16, 17, and 18, child pornography, child grooming, and online child sexual abuse, which bear similarity to a few of the provisions in this bill, Sexual Offences Bill, on sexual communication with a minor and taking indecent photographs of a minor. And there's consistency between the two bills in relation to the term of imprisonment being 10 years. But the cybercrime bill speaks as well to an alternative to fine. So it may have to be a case where there may be facts which could be deemed that they could come under either bill, where the law enforcement agency may have to make a decision whether to go under the Sexual Offences Act or the cybercrime bill, which hopefully should become law, in the foreseeable future as well. But in terms of the provisions as they relate to rape or sexual offenses alleged against persons with mental disorders and physical disability, clearly, sir, this is extremely appropriate. The relevant sections are sections 3 and sections 8, which deal respectively with rape and with violation of persons suffering from mental disorders or physical disability. And to just give a bit of historical background here, sir, because it isn't that the law is saying that persons with disabilities or persons with some kind of challenge are not entitled to basic human desires of sexual gratification or sexual desires, sir. In fact, the Convention on Persons with Disabilities implicitly and explicitly provides for sexual and reproductive health of persons with disabilities, and provides that people with disabilities, if they are capable, sir, of mental capacity, have the right, like anybody else, to adults, sir, to express themselves sexually, of course, in private, sir, with the individual with whom they choose to do so. And in fact, about 20 years ago, I seem to recall it would have been, I was then deputy chairman of the Commission to Improve the Lives of Persons with Disabilities. The late Badita was president at the time, the Honourable Member for Christchurch East, and the Honourable Prime Minister attended her funeral a few years ago. And the United Nations Development Population Fund would have funded a program in Barbados on sexual and reproductive health for persons with disabilities. That program was spearheaded at the persons with disabilities level by the late Roseanne Foster Vaughan, who was tremendous talent among people with disabilities. And I remember attending probably 3 of the sessions on that, where you were seeking to give information, more information among people with disabilities on their sexual and reproductive health, and you know, the right way to do that, but protecting those persons with disabilities who needed protection, and ensuring that they're not unfair, sir, because that is the issue here, that these 2 sections especially are seeking to address, that there are too many people in this country, sir, that look to unfair people with mental disorders and physical disabilities, sir. And I'm sure that fellow MPs here know that, because we're on the ground. You hear about cases where a person with disabilities, mentally challenged, physically challenged, may be in a particular home. I don't want to call names, sir, that is the truth. And you hear, next thing, they're pregnant. That is the truth. But they got a mental disorder. When we had the committee to improve the lives of persons with disabilities between June 2022 and last year, March, I know that these and similar issues engage the attention of committee members, the deputy chair, the most honorable Kerry-Ann Eiffel, and Janelle Odell, attorney at law, who is now a consultant within the Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs on the issue of disabilities, engage them tremendously, because, and they, of course, engage and brought it for sure for discussion among the committee, and aspects of this are in the policy which I believe was laid in Parliament today, the disabilities policy, that, you know, yes, persons with disabilities have sexual feelings like anybody, because they're normal, sir. You know, a lot of people seeing people with disabilities and want them to stay in a house, you know, what the driver parking in a car park reserved for people with disabilities for, because they should be home, they shouldn't be out at a supermarket or out enjoying themselves anyway. But they're just like everybody else, sir. But the issue, as I said, where someone has a mental disorder, might be mentally defective, sir, special needs, even though they are 21 years old, they have the mental capacity of a 10-year-old, for instance, 21 chronologically, but mental capacity of a 10-year-old, sir. And you have people unfairing them and taking advantage of them, sir. It has to bring into effect the criminal justice system, sir. And that's what these 2 sections are speaking towards, that there are too many cases of that in Barbados, sir. As I said, I know because I'm close to the community, sir. And the issue is that we certainly will want to see these provisions enforced. I know it's a question of evidence like everything else, sir. And without offending the rules of sub judice, I believe that there may be a case going on right now involving a special needs child. And it is always great to see that kind of case brought to court. So we would have met last week, Tuesday, exactly a week ago, sir, Ms. Janelle Odell, myself, I substituted for senator in the other place. Andre Boyce, who was overseas, he asked me to attend a meeting with the Honourable Attorney General on issues of persons with disabilities who are victims and indeed accused too, sir, within the criminal justice system, and the state now funding their cases. So in other words, person with disabilities, person with mental disorder, physical disability, alleges that they were raped, that they were sexually interfered with, sir, so that the state will support them in their case if it is obviously sign language interpretation, which is present right now, but in other aspects as well, in terms of legal maybe representation or advice that the state would fund that, sir. And the Honourable Attorney General agreed in principle right offhand. But yes, these have to be cases where the state would agree to give funding to support a case where a person with disabilities is victim of an alleged sexual offense. And there's a provision in the draft Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill which speaks towards that, sir. Because what the committee, the two consultants, and Senator Andre Boyce is the second consultant in the Ministry of People's Empowerment, have been doing, and I think they're almost wrapped up, is now again meeting with various ministries now specifically on the provisions of the draft bill to get consensus on it before I believe it goes back to the cabinet for consideration. So the bill, this bill before Parliament today speaks towards that there's no consent. There can't be consent if by reason of the mental disorder or physical disability that the complainant can't understand the nature of the act that is being committed on them, or can't make a decision as to whether they should be involved in this act or whether they should engage in the act, or that they can't, in fact, communicate the decision because of their mental state, sir. And that has to be right, because this Parliament has to do what is right, sir, and within the society to protect the most vulnerable. And that is so as well, both, as I said, in the section under rape, as well as the section under Section 8 under violation of persons. Similar provisions in terms of what does not constitute consent or what is incapable of committing consent, sir. And I use this forum, sir, to appeal to persons, and it could be both male and female, sir, who, as I said, take advantage in this cause against people with disabilities, people with mental incapacity or disorder, sir. There's too much of it, sir, and it has to stop because it is wrong. I mean, there are documented cases of these things, and you know, where a child may be born, the perpetrator doesn't even want to support the child in a lot of cases, sir. So these type of offenses need to be prosecuted more often. Once the complaint is made to the police, support has to be given to the alleged victim so that their complaint or their evidence can stand up in court and a conviction gained. Because again, there have been cases which have been dismissed by the judiciary because the person, the alleged victim, or the victim, sir, I could say, with a disability, didn't have the support in the court to be able to give credible evidence or cogent evidence necessary for a conviction beyond reasonable doubt. And someone who perpetrated a crime walks away free. So, sir, I just wish to make those points. There is one other section that I would wish to speak on. The Honourable Member for St. George North, I believe, referred to it, the issue of sexual activity in front of minors, and that being now criminalized. And that is a good point. I want to support that, sir. But we know the reality in this Barbados, sir. That is the truth. That there are people, adults, who may wish to give excuses that their housing circumstances are not large, and therefore, boy, they engage in sexual activity in front of minors, sir. But it's wrong. That is the truth. It's wrong, because then when those children now go out there in public, whether at school or wherever, you see some of them on Kadooment Day, sir, right? Mimicking, etc., sexual acts, and maybe, in fact, doing sexual acts at school, etc., sir. Let's face fact, that is what's going on in this Barbados, sir. You can't, as a parent, give an excuse to say that my housing circumstances, you know, militated, boy, I have nowhere to go, etc. And we know, sir, as members of Parliament, that that is the reality in some circumstances. But as a parent, you have to be responsible. As a grandparent, as an aunt, uncle, you have responsibility to the minor children who live under your roof or with you, to protect them from this, because they're going to mimic it and copy it. And so it may be difficult to get some prosecutions, to get some evidence on these acts, but that does not prevent a parliament that is mandated by the Constitution of this country to make law for the good order of this country to pass such a provision in this legislation. And I'm happy to see that that is there. It means, honourable members, especially the honourable member for the city of Bridgetown, whose ministry has the mandate for the community parenting programs in this country. I believe the program was launched in June or so this year. Certainly, as I've said before, a cohort that I involved in the last Life and Work Skills program that my foundation held earlier this year. Parent education is so important. And you know, even though it lies within the ministerial mandate of the honourable member of the city, that falls within many other ministries to deal with education, youth, community development. So all of us have that responsibility to educate those constituents of ours who are parents that they have to act responsibly, sir, in the presence of their children, and to have their actions be for the good of their children. The honourable member for St. John, I believe, was reported as saying about a week ago that parents have the first responsibility to children, sir. And I totally agree with that. While we as members of parliament, yes, have a responsibility, and the government has a responsibility, and the school and the church too, sir, that is the truth. And I say that all the time. The first and primary responsibility is the parent or the guardian. And therefore, I'm happy to see such a provision, new provision in this legislation, sir. Sir, as I said, I support this legislation and look forward to its enactment, but not only to its enactment, but towards its implementation and enforcement by those in authority. Much I'm obliged to you, sir.
Honourable Member for Microsoft Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be brief in my remarks, but I believe that these amendments are sufficiently important as to merit a perspective not just like those that were so ably given by those who spoke before me, not simply on the sections that are subject to the amendment, and on the reasons and on the progress that we are now making in this conversation and in this area of law. But I simply have a few remarks to make, sir, on what I see as the landscape in which these amendments are being made. What I see as the policy and legislative coherence that this government is bringing to this parliament and through this parliament to the people of this country. The honourable member who spoke before me made reference to some of it. He mentioned the fact that in the cybercrime legislation, which the report on which, having gone before the Standing Committee on Governance, is now before the Senate, and that has seen some amendments that we will soon discuss. That legislation also demonstrates a certain level of legislative coherence, and I want us all to appreciate the importance of that. Essentially to say that there will be no safe harbor under the law for people who seek to offend in this way. Whether it is in the child justice legislation, child protection legislation, in the sexual offenses legislation as being amended here today or proposed to be amended here today, or in the cybercrime legislation. Because to the extent that the cybercrime legislation makes reference to child pornography as an offense, to child grooming as an offense, as does this legislation in both regards, and to online child sexual abuse as an offense. That we are making sure that across all of the relevant areas where people may act, that children and people who require protection are protected. You know, sir, it seems to me, especially given recent events with respect to cybercrime, that we seem to feel as if one area is theoretical or virtual, that crimes that take place in this jurisdiction or this domain are not real, but they have real consequences. And in fact, child grooming can be so, to the extent that it is often invisible online. The Honourable Attorney General gave a story of a young man who was the victim of sexual grooming as a minor by an adult. And people are seeing all of the times that he happens to meet up with this young man. In an online environment, people are not seeing. And so in fact, we have an even greater responsibility to protect young people in those environments. I had occasion to say recently during an opening of a business that the other thing that we will be coming to examine very soon and asking the participation of the public on this is how do we protect and speak to children's online activity when it comes to things like gaming? The amount of time that children spend online, the kinds of activities that they're doing online. There was a recent report that assessed the danger of certain common online activities that children do. And one of the ones that was flagged, and I'll call the name because this is a public report, is a game that many of our children play. So it is not necessarily Fortnite or Grand Theft Auto. Some of us even here play some of the ones that I'm calling. But Roblox, which is something that 7 and 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds play, has been deemed as one of the most dangerous, not necessarily because of the game itself, but because of the communities that convene around these games and the conversations that take place, and the fact that actually often there are adults and others who would seek to do harm lurking in these environments, engaging our children. And it is one of the things that we have to be able to turn some attention to. So, sir, I speak to the coherence because I want us all to appreciate that these are direct and intentional efforts by a government to increase protection for those who would be vulnerable. The child justice legislation, the child protection legislation, the fact that, and I'll come to it in a minute, that we saw it fit to remove wandering as an offense because of the harm that it was causing and because of the fact that it was not allowing us to have a frank conversation about why children may leave the environments in which they live and go to other places. But sir, one of the main points I want to make is simply this: that sexual and gender-based violence is a continuum. And that is why we've treated grooming in the way that we have. It is a continuum. Sexual and gender-based violence and the environment that we create when we allow for these kinds of acts to take place without bringing to bear the full weight of the law and of our other legislative actions, of our other actions as a society, when we allow them to go unchecked, is when people are no longer protected. The Honourable Member for St. George North made reference to this in the beginning of her remarks, is that any consciousness, any national consciousness that allows a person to take control of another person's body for their own pleasure or for their own will to be done. We see that in many kinds of acts, sir, of criminal acts. We see it in rape and incest, as is covered by this legislation. We see it in gender-based violence. It is part of the same thinking. It is part of the same position and approach, that a person believes that what happens to your body, to another person's body, is for me to determine. So if you say something I don't like, because I am stronger than you and larger than you, I will slap you in your face. If you take a decision that affects my life in some way that I determine, even though it is your decision to make, I may choose to end your life. Sir, the incidents of rape and other forms of sexual violence, the incidents of gender-based violence that often ends in murder in this country and in this region, is one that is only addressed when we take these kinds of steps to send the message that a person's bodily autonomy has to be protected by the state. Now, I would have to go further to say that how we treat children and whether we determine that we can discipline a child by striking a child or by force is also a part of that conversation. Because how can we choose where a minor and under what circumstances a minor is protected from violence? That is a part of the conversation that we have to continue. But I also wish to say that, as others have said before, it is not just about what we write into law and what we enforce under the law. It is also about the other actors. I hear people use language, when I say the other actors, I'm talking about the media. I'm talking about how we talk about these things in our schools, in our churches, in the corridors. I hear people say things like, that fella interfere with she. Somebody trouble her. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. And we do that because we're trying to make it seem benign. We're trying to be polite about something that is not polite at all. You heard the member from St. Philip North talk about her experience as a doctor with dealing with survivors of sexual violence. It is not polite. So to say that somebody troubled somebody, I do not use that language. And I do not know what you mean when you use that language. Was the person raped, sexually assaulted? What was the act? Because it's only when we get real and confront what is happening to people that we understand the severity of what we are dealing with here. A girl who is sexually assaulted was not troubled, and she was not interfered with. And similarly, the language in the media has to be frontally addressed. Because so often we are talking about cases of rape, we are talking about cases where a minor, as this legislation says, cannot consent, and we say that the minor has had sex with, or that the adult has had sex with. You cannot have sex with a minor as an adult. That is rape. And so until we start to get very clear in our language and not treat things under the cover of giggles and blushing and acting as if it is some kind of little community secret, it is only then that we will start to really address and start to have a frank conversation about, beyond legislation, what are the measures, what are the activities, what is the action by each of us that is going to begin to change and to move this situation. It also relates to the sexualization of children. And it is something that we do because we want to take nice pictures sometimes. But there are ways in which, and I'll give an example. We would have a baby, a boy, 1 year old, 2 years old. And this is a baby in arms, and you bring this baby to a fair or to a karaoke, and the baby starts reaching out to women around or to men around or to somebody. And because often women congregate around a baby that they haven't seen before, and the child reaches out, they'll say, I see, he like the girls already. He's girls' man. I know that we think that we are joking, but it comes from a certain kind of consciousness that we start to sexualize children even before they can walk. We start to say things like, there's somebody has a boy child and somebody has a girl child, and they're toddling around, and one person says, give she a kiss. For what? We think that these are harmless kinds of utterances, but they're not. The way in which we allow children to express themselves has to be removed at that stage in their lives from this kind of sexual framing. The way that we dress our children, 4 and 5 and 6 year olds, has to be removed from this kind of sexual framing. That is not to say, sir, that we don't have to leave room for sexual development as a stage of a child's development. Because that is the other perversion of what we do. We over-sexualize children from 0 to 14. And then at the point at which children are actually fully coming into their sexual identity, we tell them, you're not a woman in here. Which is it? It is time for us to be able to have a real and frank conversation about sexual expression throughout a person's life cycle, so that we don't have these hushed tones and whispers when the wrong thing happens in our communities, in our schools, in our sporting and social clubs, in our churches. You know, I often remark on what I perceive sometimes as the dilemma that faces young women who, I went to a consultation many years ago, a consultation on, with respect to the education sector, and sexual and reproductive rights with respect to the education sector and the school system and so on. And one man who was an educator, this is many years ago, this has to be over 15 years now, got up and said, but what are we going to do about these girls in the schools with these breasts? What are we going to do about these girls in the schools with these breasts as if they could leave them home? His problem was that he felt uncomfortable with the literal sexual expression of a woman and the fact that she's leaving home with that. There's an extent to which we want to police that too. We want to tell women when to be women, when to express their sexuality, and when it doesn't suit us. These are conversations that we have to be having. The final thing I want to say, sir, I promised to be short, is that there's also such a thing as something that is suitable for a child, for an adult, that is not suitable for a child. And as parents, as communities, as a society, to be able to draw that line. The notion that certain kinds of cultural expression, as the Honourable Leader of the Opposition made reference to today, must be removed because children exist among us is absurd. There are all kinds of behaviors that our parents said to us, this is not for you at this time. This is for adult people at this time. But the dilemma that we have is that we are not having a frank conversation. We are not having a conversation which says to our young people, it is all right for you to want to like a boy or for a boy to like you. I will tell you that when I was growing up, there was this idea in my home, in my community, that as long as you were living in the home of an adult who was responsible for you, that you were a child, right? So you are 17, 18, 19. You are living in the home of an adult who's responsible for you. And so in none of those paths of development, as either a boy child or a girl child, are you supposed to express. And so, you know, I have godchildren and who would come and tell me that they like a girl. And I would have a conversation with them. What does that mean to you? How do you all express that? Not when I was growing up. You could like a boy and tell your mother, you better like some schoolwork. And while that had its effect, what was absent in that context was an honest conversation. What does it mean to you to like a boy? How do you express that? Talk to me about that. Tell me about that. Tell me about how you're feeling. It is only when we create that safe environment for children to start to step into their sexual identity. It starts when they're children. Let us not fool ourselves. It starts when they are still in our care. And if we don't send the message to them that their sexual identity and expression has a safe space in which to exist, we are going to continue to have poor decision-making among our young people when it comes to sexual expression and sexual behavior. And we will also continue to have an environment in which they do not come to us and tell us when someone has harmed them. This is a matter for legislation, and I very much welcome these amendments, but it is so much more a matter for conversation among ourselves, with our children, and with all the institutions that have to be responsible for protection in this country. Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to you.
Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to add my voice to this particular piece of legislation. I believe those who have come before me have ably represented not only the law, but certainly various perspectives in relation to why we are doing this and what we hope to accomplish by this piece of legislation, the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill. But before I begin, Mr. Speaker, I think it would be remiss of me if I did not address a matter that arose earlier. I believe that sometimes the Honourable Leader of the Opposition determines that there are a few of us in here that he wants to rattle, and perhaps I have now fallen into that category. But I want to make it clear to this chamber that this is a very serious place, and I will not respond to untruths in a way that will certainly bring this place in terms of being criticized or being brought into ridicule. But suffice to say that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition indicated that he had gotten limited notice of what we were debating today. And I want to make it clear to all who can hear that irrespective of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition now holding that position and no longer being on this side, this Leader of Government Business, on every single occasion, not only do I share what we are doing with the Honourable members on this side, Mr. Speaker, but I make sure that I share the information on the Leader of the Opposition's 2 cell phone numbers that I have for him. I don't know if his constituents have all 2 of those numbers, but they are the 2 numbers that he has given to me, and I share the information with respect to any legislation that we are in the process of debating in this chamber. And just as I would have shared with the parliamentary group, I would have shared with the Honourable Leader of the Opposition as well, indicating on Sunday what it is that we were intending to do on Tuesday. Now, I know that he is not familiar with coming to Parliament. I know he is not familiar with colliding with this place in terms of understanding the way in which we make decisions as to what we do on the order paper. But I want the public to be clear in their minds that this administration, and particularly this Leader of Government Business, does not mix or split hairs when it comes to advising whether on this side or the other side what they must do, Mr. Speaker, and I want that to go clearly. He acknowledged the information that was sent to him, and therefore if he has come here unprepared today to debate this particular piece of legislation, that is not to fall on the members of this administration. I also want to make it clear that many pieces of legislation as well are also placed on the barbadosparliament.com website. And when notice is given both by email but also placed on the website, all honourable members have notice of any legislation that is to be debated in this place. Now, on the 19th of September, this particular bill, the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill, was given notice of, Mr. Speaker, and you are aware of this, as are all other members. It has been on the Parliament's website. Again, if the honourable member is in earshot, he will understand that he can go to www.barbadosparliament.com. He can go to resolutions within the House and bills within the House of Assembly, and he will see a list of bills as well as the resolutions in relation to this place, as well as the Senate, sir. And I want to make that clear because I do not like the misrepresentations being made by people who ought to know better. There are young people who come to this Parliament, who listen to this Parliament, who expect of us a certain degree of honesty and truthfulness in this place, Mr. Speaker. And it really galls my soul when I have to sit in here and listen to these types of things from people who ought to know better. So I want to start there. We've all had notice of this piece of legislation. We've all come here because this piece of legislation is part of an underlying philosophy of the Barbados Labour Party government, one which looks at protecting and ensuring that certain rights of individuals are protected, particularly our minors, particularly vulnerable individuals. It is something, Mr. Speaker, that for as long as I have known myself, the Barbados Labour Party has been at the forefront of making sure that people are protected in terms of their various rights, both the offenders and also the ones who are innocent or the alleged victims as well. And the truth of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that this piece of legislation, I know it has been in response as well to a challenge in terms of constitutionality of the earlier sections, Section 9 and I believe Section 12 of the Act. And while some may want to say that we are reacting, the reality is that we did not leave the alleged victims exposed in any way, because while we have been working through the Attorney General's chambers and CPC to draft this particular bill, obviously there was still protection that was afforded to any alleged victims. But what we've sought to do here today is consistent with what we've been doing with other pieces of legislation. We must accept that as we have now moved to becoming a republic, we are at that juncture where we are having a number of pieces of legislation that are having to be revised. In some cases, some pieces have to be repealed, because whether it is the language, the tone, the intent, things have changed so much that we are now in a position where we recognize that we could not have been an educated population and continue to do things in the same way over and over. So where we have recognized, for instance, as the Honourable Member for St. James North spoke to, that this legislation had language in it that spoke to persons who were vulnerable in terms of having disabilities and things of that nature, having those persons referred to in a negative way, a way that none of us right-thinking people in this country believe that persons should be spoken of in that descriptive way that seem to be acceptable in our society. And we've taken a position that, you know, what may have obtained and what may have been acceptable previously is not something that any of us would want either to nowadays or even for the generation to come to be acceptable in their eyes. And I want to really thank the Attorney General's chambers as well as CPC, because I do know that we've had a lot of legislation come in at a fast pace to this chamber. We've probably passed more legislation than any administration previous to us. And I know that it is often difficult. Sometimes there are a few amendments that have to be made. But generally, I think that we are on the right trajectory in terms of being able to make the legislative changes that are necessary to update our laws. I want to turn, though, to this issue of I think it's Section 3? Section 5? No, Section 3, which refers to rape. Because much has been said in relation to what we are doing in relation to this section. You know, I listened to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition trying to read all kinds of things into this particular amendment, and reading all kinds of things that, again, are quite disappointing coming from what I consider to be the leadership of this country. You know, we have come a long way in terms of our colonial past. And, you know, there was a time when there was a British jurist who used to say that when it related to the marital rape exemption, that the husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their matrimonial consent and contract, the wife have given herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract. And I believe the Honourable Member for St. George North, who spoke earlier, kind of alluded to the thinking that kind of exists in our society as it relates to some of these issues, where women were viewed as chattel. And there was a point where women themselves couldn't vote, where women, again, were treated as though they were substandard, that they were the property of men. And Mr. Speaker, I think, you know, again, we are all a little bit more educated nowadays, and we understand that what may have obtained and what may have been viewed in that way in the past is certainly not the way that any of us, I believe, in this chamber either see ourselves as women with the amount of strides that have been made for the enhancement and improvement of the lives of women. But equally, I would hope that my colleagues, and certainly others who have the ability to make laws, do not view women in the same way. And therefore, the changes that are being made here are not about whether we support as a party homosexuality or anything of that nature, because I personally believe to each his own. The only person who should judge anybody is God and God himself. And therefore, I am not here to be no hypocrite or to be judgmental of anybody, what they choose to do behind closed doors. But what I do know, and what I have been taught, what I have read, what I have been exposed to, is that we have a responsibility as legislators to ensure that we do not have laws that discriminate against people, that people must feel free and comfortable to live an active life in this country without fear of ridicule and contempt for the lifestyle that they may choose. Now, where that borders on interfering with little children, that's where I draw the line, Mr. Speaker, and that's where I, as many others, will have a problem with it. But if two consenting adults decide how they are to live their life, well, as far as I'm concerned, that is a matter for them. And the God, certainly, that I have served from the time I have known myself is a God that says, judge not, lest he be judged. So I don't know what other Bible others may read, but I certainly am of the view that discrimination in all its forms ought not to be tolerated. It does not make me a supporter of any particular mandate. Any international organization don't have to come and have a consultation with me about anything. These are things that I, Mr. Speaker, believe, and I believe that I am in the company of other people who believe that discrimination in all forms is not something that, as an educated population, that we ought to tolerate today. And so I'm grateful that we've been able to make this change in terms of the language, making sure that not only the language now reads not in relation to just a male or to a husband, but it reads in relation to a spouse, and that spouse can be either male or female. And I think that's a significant step in terms of our further recognition legislatively, that we have a responsibility to change these things in our legislation when we see it, and to be able to deal with it and confront it readily. You know, we are not backing off of this position, and the Honourable Leader of the Opposition cannot make anybody in here take a different position than they have taken, because we are firm in our belief that people must not be discriminated against. And I would just say, Mr. Speaker, some of the best people, the best minds in our country over the years on both political sides have been people who have been homosexual, who have had different sexual preferences than many of the rest of us. But it has not stopped them from performing at their full capacity and giving of their best to this country. And just as we take the position on people who are vulnerable in terms of people with disabilities, this is the same position we take in relation to when it comes to gender and many of these other issues. Now, Mr. Speaker, I support as well the introduction of this whole issue of grooming, because many of the statistics will show that prior to us being able to get to the point where an offense has been committed, you have a series of things that happen in terms of getting to that point. When I was former Minister of Education, a number of things came to me in terms of situations, and I will speak specifically to the schools for a minute, but not to say that the schools alone, these are the problems that exist, because I heard the AG very loud and clear say that there are about 500 sexual offenses still to be tried before the court, and I know that some of those relate to our minor children, and many of them have also been carried on within the school environment. In other words, you have situations, Mr. Speaker, that our young people placed in sometimes an environment of trust within a school environment. Sometimes, because of the technology now, they communicate with the teachers communicate back with them. And sometimes what we found over the years was that some of the text messaging may not have been appropriate in terms of the messages that were relayed back and forth. In many cases, you saw the messages that were on the phones coming from the teachers saying things like, you know, call me daddy. I remember a situation where a teacher was sending messages to a child at primary school. The mother was out and he was communicating with her and he's telling her, call me daddy. And of course, the father was not present in her life, but he was assuming the role as a father, as somebody or a father figure who was supposed to be responsible. But as the text messages continued, it then became clearer and clearer that this individual was actually in a position of power because the person was actually, I think, a physical education teacher at the time, and obviously involved in these young women, in whether it was in their short pants or otherwise. And I must tell you, Mr. Speaker, I speak about these things because, you know, these are real life situations that happen to our young people, to our minors, and there are things, as the Honourable last speaker spoke about, that we don't like to talk about sometimes. Because oftentimes we are careful to say what we say because we know that we may be connected to the person who has been accused of the alleged act. This is a small society, and many times the perpetrators are well known within the society as well. They're well known within the school environment, they're well known in in the community environment. And we come from a situation where a lot of times we don't like to bell the cat. It is the problem that is permeating our entire system where people do not want to call a spade a spade. But I speak to the issues within education because while I was minister, I had a policy whereby we would ensure that we reported to the authorities any alleged cases of that nature, where persons were seeking to groom the individuals into some sexual conduct, where there was actual, whether it was rape, whether it was any form of assault on a minor. And we had a policy where we would report these incidences to the police. We would also make sure that we reported them to the Service Commission. Now, despite reporting and sending all of the information, and I know that the Honourable Minister who preceded me takes a similar stance on these matters, is very firm as I was on these matters, as well as the persons in the leadership at the Ministry of Education, that these matters needed to be dealt with and expedited as quickly as possible. And why, Mr. Speaker? Because you have young people who are scarred in many cases for life because of these incidences that take place where that position of trust has been breached with somebody in that environment. Why should these cases be expedited, Mr. Speaker? Because what we see in terms of these 500 cases that have not been yet addressed, but I know the AG is working towards getting them addressed, is that those 500 people have 500 victims. And sometimes those 500 victims are the mothers or the fathers of children, or one child or more, as my colleagues are rightly saying. And in some cases, you have, because those persons have not been able to resolve their own issues mentally in relation to what they have gone through, they end up raising a generation with just as many issues as they have. And I see it on a day-to-day basis with people who, you know, we would say, but why are you not parenting the children in a particular way? Why aren't you doing this and why are you doing that? But when you dig a little deeper and you ask them about, you know, what may have unfolded when they were young, they too have been the victims of the rape and the sexual assault and the sexual abuse and all of these violent offenses that have not been resolved because in many cases, they are one of the 500 cases that may still be outstanding. And similarly, you have had cases within the school system, which even though we have sent them to the commission, we are still waiting in many cases for those cases to be heard. Now, I will say, Mr. Speaker, that while we can place the information where it ought to, whether it be by the police or through the commission, there are some issues that we still have to deal with. And one of those is that sometimes the parents, despite pursuing the matter to a certain point, parents themselves will say, "Ma, don't bother with that. The child can deal with it. We don't worry about that. We don't want to drag the child through these things." And yet again, the child is then forced to come up through life having to carry the burden of these unresolved issues on them, and then they become the parents of some of the same children that given us licks within the same system, because they are themselves broken. And many cases, they are broken and they are raising children sometimes who are also broken, Mr. Speaker. And I speak in this way, and more as a cry for help for those persons and an urgent call for us to be able to address these matters, to expedite these matters. because I see how broken our families are, how broken these parents are, a lot of times having to try to cope with their own issues, but also trying to raise another generation. And when we ask him why the youth are behaving, why they're behaving, Mr. Speaker, there are many, 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 many complex issues as to why we see young people and even elder people acting out the way they do, because they are dealing with a number of unresolved issues on a day-to-day basis. Now, I know that the AG has put in place and he's accepted that, 500 is 500 too many. But I'm calling on the additional resources to help to address some of these issues. Just as we are doing with gun violence, I want to make the call for us to be able to equally become as aggressive in dealing with whether it is persons within communities who interfere with young people, whether it is teachers within the systems, even sometimes it is security guards, sometimes it is the janitor within a school environment, persons who are in trust relationships with our young people, who have breached that trust relationship. And we have to look at how do young people speak to these things? How do they tell the guidance counselors? Are they feeling as though there will be a trust relationship with the persons in authority who they have to speak to? Because, Mr. Speaker, that is really at the crux of why a lot of people don't come forward and say what is going on. The wife don't talk about what is going on because she know that it can seem as though, she's not giving up to the husband what she ought to, what she contracted to do. The child don't want to say what is going on because the child is afraid of the repercussions, because the child may be the stepchild in a household and knows that the mother is dependent on the stepfather for money to be able to send it to school, and it doesn't want to say anything because of the repercussions that come. But I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that the repercussions are greater than I think we even appreciate in our society, because the repercussions are causing us to lose almost entire generations, because people are dealing with these unresolved issues. And I think that we need additional support, not just in terms of being able to expedite the cases, but we need to make sure that we look at what is happening with these young persons who have been interfered with, who have been assaulted, who have been raped within the system, and be able to ensure that we get the necessary counseling for them as quickly as possible to avert further deterioration within our society of our young men and indeed our young women as well. The internet, Mr. Speaker, has also created additional challenges, and the last speaker who spoke hit the nail on the head, because the truth is that, parents are giving their children devices, and devices are a good thing on the one hand, but they're also not sometimes clued into what is happening on those devices and who our young people are talking to. And I want to encourage parents to pay attention to what is happening on the cell phone. If you believe the child is old enough to carry the cell phone to be able to make a call to you from school, or if the bus is late, then you also have to have an equal eye in terms of what is actually being communicated on that cell phone as well. And it's not simply it's not an invasion of privacy, but I think we have to accept that we live in a real world today where these things are very real. I remember a few months ago, I got a call from a very influential businessman from overseas whose family lives here in Barbados. And his daughter was on the internet going through on her cell phone, and a gentleman from overseas was sending nude pictures of himself to her. I've had my own constituents experience these things where the children, again, parents not paying too much attention, but when they do, they discover conversations, they discover content that ought not to be in circulation in the hands of our young people as well. And I think our parents need to be vigilant as well. Our schools need to be vigilant, because we on the one hand are embracing technology, but we also have to educate and be aware of what are some of the dangers of technology if it is not addressed in a positive way as well. Now, this legislation also addresses the issue of the stepchildren, and I think that is a good step as well in terms of being able to recognize that the issues don't only lie with the child of an individual, but also sometimes you have a number of stepchildren in households, and I think we've taken that into account also, and I would want to support that particular provision. This issue of engaging in sexual activity in the presence of a minor is also another real life thing for me. I have repeatedly spoken to this issue of overcrowding in households because I have seen what happens in small units where you have 4 households within a household, where there is a bed and then there is a mattress, and then you have boys, girls, aunties, uncles, boyfriends, stepchildren, outside man, outside woman, everybody coming to the house and sleeping. And in the middle of the night, or when mom is out working, or dad is out working, somebody reaches over and feels at one of the little girls or the little boys. These are the realities, right? So when I speak sometimes about this urgency as well for us to improve housing conditions, it is because I firmly believe that our social conditions are also a big cause of why we are seeing this fallout within our society, which is attendant to the issues of crime. It is attendant to the issues that we see in relation to incest and sexual abuse and rape of our minors. These are the realities. It also creeps in relation to the issues of violence, because when you have tensions within a household, when one person bringing home the money and the other person isn't working, and there's conflict over who can go in which cupboard to take out what food. These are the realities of what ordinary Barbadians are facing on a day-to-day basis. And we have to appreciate that this legislation is addressing those scenarios where you will, in some cases, have situations where adults are engaging in sexual activities in a space that was not intended for all of these people to be in, but because of the size of the household, our children are being exposed to a lot of images that otherwise they ought not to be. Now this legislation is also addressing the issue of the content that persons may display to children as well, the pornographic content. And I heard the Honourable Member speak earlier about what he called it, moral decadence taking over. You know, I am tempted to speak to this issue of pornography and give him a couple of reminders on his side of things that have taken place in this country. But I think the people of this country understand that you can't be a hypocrite. We are all trying our best to do what we can to keep the society stable. This issue of sexual offenses is not a political football. But I also believe that people in glass houses should not throw stones. And just as stones start to get thrown on this side, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member would do well to look within the bosom of the Democratic Labour Party and the party that he leads to make sure that the issue of moral decadence is not at his doorstep. And I will leave that there. So, Mr. Speaker, I support this bill. I think that our children as well need to be educated about the implications of this legislation. They also need to be educated about the Child Protection and the Child Justice Bill. And I think consistent with what we are doing here, when you look at the child protection legislation, the whole issue of mandatory reporting comes up, because mandatory reporting is now on a wide range of persons, from the parents to the persons in educational institutions, the teachers, anybody who is affiliated with the technology. They all now have a responsibility under the legislation not to turn a blind eye. And I agree that we must speak to these issues more, because what you're trying to do is to reverse decades where some of this behavior has become acceptable. And it is only if we speak to these things in a firm manner, not pointing fingers, but saying, look, we need to bring down the cases. We need to address the cases when they come before the courts. We need to tell parents that if your child has been involved in some form of sexual activity or indecent exposure in this way with an adult, that you don't hide it up. It cannot be simply about putting food on the table when you are scarring sometimes these children for the rest of their lives, Mr. Speaker. These are the messages that we need to continue to send, and these are the support systems that we need to put in place to allow people to be able to talk about the experiences that they have had, but also to address quickly a lot of the challenges that we are seeing within the system, because this is also at the root cause of where our society has broken down in many cases. We need to expedite these cases, and it cannot be that only some people face the law courts and others don't. Rape, molestation of minors, sexual offenses against minors, Mr. Speaker. We become hypocrites if everybody who is alleged does not face their day in court. And if we don't follow the steps to make sure that we protect our victims as well. And I certainly will not be part of any hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker, because if you are accused of something, then the system is there to be able to make sure that you go through the system in order to be heard and to have a fair trial. But equally, we must find balance. And that's, I think, what we are trying to do in this legislation, to make sure that we find balance between the victim and also ensuring and preserving the rights of the accused as well. And persons like yourself, Mr. Speaker, will, I'm sure, be consulted quite a bit in relation to these amendments as well for persons who may be accused. And so, Mr. Speaker, I just want to, again, endorse the bill and to support the comments that have been made by my colleagues, to thank the Attorney General for leading this debate and for being able to work on this piece of legislation to be able to get us to this point, and to say really to the public that, you know, this is the time now to break down this legislation, to understand it, and to make use of it, and to not allow us to be putting legislation in place which can actually help to save our society, whether in this way or through child justice or child protection, and we turn a blind eye to it. And with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I am obliged.
Honourable St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure that I won't be long. I appreciate the very incisive and cogent comments that have been presented in this chamber by the members on this side. I think it is fair to say that there's a recognition that even without the court decision which triggered this entire process, the time had come for us to make some important changes to the law in relation to sexual offenses. The decision of the court was not welcome in some parts of wider Barbados, but I'm grateful to the Leader of the Opposition, if only for one thing, and that is reminding Barbados that we have something called separation of powers. The doctrine of separation of powers, Mr. Speaker, says that the courts decide as they will and as they wish. It is for Parliament to, if we don't agree with the decision of the court, we pass a law which conforms with the norms and practices that the court says will be best and will be within the provisions or the four corners of our Constitution. So let me thank members for their support. There are just a couple of things, or perhaps really only one significant thing on the other side that I would want to comment on. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition tried to make very heavy weather of the fact that we now have introduced into the Sexual Offences Act the term spouse. Or so he thought. He thought that we had introduced the term spouse, and I'm very grateful to my colleague, the Minister of Home Affairs, for reminding him that the term spouse is already defined in the Act. In fact, I believe that spouse is the only term that was defined in the 1982 Act, the only term. But it is evident that the Honourable Member refuses to prepare for our debates. It wasn't long ago that he made a comment that we needed to amend the law to refuse bail to people charged with firearm offenses and murder and so on, forgetting that he was in this parliament when that amendment was made. He wasn't here in 1992, but had he troubled to prepare himself faithfully as he pretends to for this debate, he would have seen the provision that the Honourable Minister of Home Affairs pointed him to. But he doubled down because he wanted to suggest somewhat salaciously that the use of the term spouse in this instance was going to be an act preparatory to moving our law into a recognition of same-sex marriages or something of the sort which he fears. I'm grateful for the fact that the members of the public do still listen to us. And one of them reminded me that in 1992, the party that he now leads passed the Domestic Violence Protection Order Act. And in that 1992 act, the term spouse was used. The term spouse was used and the term spouse was defined. And what did it say? Spouse includes a party to a relationship where the parties are living with each other as husband and wife. And in his mind, that is the ordinary sense in which the term spouse could be used. But then in 2016, the party that he now leads came back to this chamber and amended spouse even further. And in the 2016 amendment to the Domestic Violence Protection Order Act, spouse was now defined as a party to a marriage or cohabital relationship. That's all it said. A party to a marriage or cohabital relationship. Mr. Speaker, we have asked this chamber to agree with us and to make a common sense approach to the law in relation to rape, to say that rape is not limited to husband against wife, but it can be spouse against spouse without any need to say a female spouse against a male spouse or a male spouse against a female spouse. But when he reflects on what his government did, somehow he's fine with that. He's fine with how they approach the term spouse. But when we use it, there is something sinister about it. Well, that is the level of hypocrisy that the members, the sole member on the other side, seeks to stoop to when it comes to a debate. Happy that the leader of government business reminded him that this bill was on the order paper since the 19th of September. You know, Mr. Speaker, for somebody who got up in this chamber and time after time castigated the learned Attorney General for not bringing to Parliament the amendments to the Sexual Offences Act, you would have thought that he would have been rejoicing that they were coming today. You would have thought that when he saw that notice was sent, because, you know, and the leader of government business said that it is put on the website, but it's not just put on the website. Each member is given notice of the bill. Each member is given notice of the bill. The bill is then laid a first time. I believe this was laid the first time when last Parliament met. So you not only have the written notice of it, you have the public notice of it when it is laid for the first time. So one would have thought that having clamored for it in the way that he did, that he would have been rejoicing at it coming and that we're debating it today, but instead he says he only knew about it. He saw it for the first time this morning. but that it is written in English, and he stands ready to debate it. Well, I'm very glad that it was written in English, because having read it for the first time this morning, he has contributed very little to the public understanding of that which was written in English. Mr. Speaker, there will be an opportunity for the lawyers who practice at the bar to look at this legislation. The honourable member said that we were threatening people's constitutional rights, and on and on and on. This is a dangerous amendment, he said. His typical recourse, Mr. Speaker, in every debate on any law is to say that we are looking to tread on the human rights of Barbadians, that we are looking to breach the Constitution. Every single time he says it. There's no debate in here where a law is passed that the honourable member does not say that we are looking to unfair people and threaten their constitutional rights and so on. And, you know, once more, he has been brought to Christian understanding that that which he deems as being dangerous, that which he deems as being pernicious, nefarious, all the words you could use to describe what we're doing here is something that the law has long sanctioned. And not just in Barbados, if we feel we had to justify it. Many jurisdictions across the world have taken exactly this position, that no corroboration is required. And having spouted the doctrine of judicial independence and the separation of powers, he fails to acknowledge the fact that if there is not sufficient evidence to cause a jury to accept that beyond a reasonable doubt the person is guilty, then they will get off. They will get off. Mr. Speaker, I am honored to have been able to bring these amendments. I'm grateful for the Chamber greeting with such enthusiasm and acclaim the new provisions which deal with how we protect our children. I hope that the society as a whole will view those particular provisions as a signal that this administration is deeply committed to making sure that the children of Barbados can live out their childhood and become adults, knowing that the law protects them from predatory and immoral conduct. Because that is who we are. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move. I think I've already moved that this bill be read a third time, but a second time, but I do so again, sir.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that you do not leave the chair and that this House resolve itself into committee for further consideration of the bill.
Question is that the Speaker do not leave the chair and the House resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. All those honourable members, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
This Honourable House is now in committee. Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All honourable members in favour, say aye. Honourable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. All honourable members in favour, say aye. Honourable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that clause 3 stand part. All honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 4 stand part.
The question is that clause 4 stand part. All honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 5 stand part.
The question is that clause 5 stand part. Honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 6.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 6 stand part.
The question is that clause 6 stand part. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Thinks the ayes have it.
Clause 7.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 7 stand part.
The question is that clause 7 stand part. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 8.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 8 stand part.
The question is that clause 8 stand part. Honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 9.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 9 stand part.
The question is that clause 9 stand part. Honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
We have your permission, sir. Clause, the remaining clauses and parts.
You do, sir.
Yeah,
Clause
clause
10.
10 to 23.
Clause, they call them 2 batches. Clause 10 to 15, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 10 to 15 stand part. Clauses 10 to 15.
The question is that clauses 10 to 15 stand part. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 16 to 23.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 16 to 23 stand part.
The question is that clauses 16 to 23 stand part. Honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the Speaker the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the Speaker the passing of one bill in committee. Honorable members in favor, say aye. Honorable members against, say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable Member for St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
Question is that this bill be read a third time. All those honourable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be cited to that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Sexual Offences Amendment Act 2024.
The question is that this bill be passed and so cited. All those honourable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This bill is passed and so cited. Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the adjournment of the House until Tuesday, the 22nd of October at 10 a.m.
The question is that this honourable chamber be adjourned until Tuesday, the 22nd of October at 10 a.m. in the forenoon. All those honourable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This honourable chamber stands adjourned until Tuesday, the 22nd day of October, 2024 at 10 a.m. in the forenoon.